We were pretty confident that he had both chemical and biological weapons. It was the biggest fear that we had as we came up to the Gulf War. But he was given an unmistakable message that the response would be dramatic if he chose to use that sort of weapon in the conflict to come. He was told diplomatically precisely the scale of response there would be, but I don't wish to enlarge on that.
On the 7th of January 1991, John Major flew to the Gulf to see the situation at first hand. The conflict turned out to be John Major's honeymoon as Prime Minister. He was popular at home. On the diplomatic front, he impressed the Americans and Russians with his negotiating skill, and his personal style was well suited to his encounters with the desert rats.
Fine. Well, thank you very much indeed. I must say it's worse than the House of Commons, isn't it? Look at you.
Meeting the young combat troops was a moving experience for the Prime Minister, who realized that he would soon be sending them into war.
Thinking there and what we think is happening. If I could just say...
When I had met the servicemen, I had been very struck by how young they were. They were pretty much the same age as my son. My son was just a little bit younger. And when I thought of them and saw them, I often inadvertently transposed James's face on their bodies. I could see those young men as just a little older than my own son.
With that thought in mind, John Major made a prime ministerial broadcast to the nation on his return to Britain.
And our prayers are also for you, their families, who carry so much of the burden of Saddam's war. We are no less proud of you. Good night, and God bless.
When I saw that, I threw a fit. I dare say others did too. I thought it was not the sort of thing. I thought it was a bit naff, to be honest. But he was absolutely dead right. When he said it, it sounded right. It clearly went down well. It just shows how wrong advisors can get it.
Just before midnight, on Wednesday the 16th of January, Operation Desert Storm began. 5 weeks later, ground troops attacked Iraqi forces and recaptured Kuwait. On the 28th of February, President Bush announced a ceasefire, leaving Saddam Hussein in power in Iraq. Many predicted that he would fall from power within the year. In the months to come, Mrs. Thatcher would criticize John Major and George Bush for not ordering troops to press on to Baghdad.
The United Nations resolutions gave the Allies the authority to expel the Iraqis from Kuwait. It expressly did not give the Allies the authority to proceed into Iraq and to drag Saddam Hussein out by the heels. We would have broken the law, we would have broken up the coalition, we would perhaps never have been able to put such a coalition together again in the future. Add to that the fact that the generals said we should stop, that the soldiers were engaged on what people at the time were calling a turkey shoot. These were all points that the hindsight warriors, who tell us with the benefit of 50-50 vision much later that we should have done something different. It was very, very, very frustrating. But we had gone to war to maintain the rule of law, not to break the rule of law.
Early in March 1991, John Major returned to the Gulf to express his gratitude to British troops for their contribution.
Chris, thank you very much indeed. This will give me cabinet authority of a sort.
John Major's personal standing was never higher. An opinion poll showed that he was the most liked Prime Minister for 30 years. The war had given him a new confidence and authority. By contrast, Margaret Thatcher was finding it difficult to fill her days.
My grandson, I took to Hamleys this morning. Nearly 2. And what did you buy? What did we buy? We bought a railway line.
You know, many people have said maybe Mrs. Thatcher should have been given a role after she left office. If something could be found for her, whether in Britain or internationally, she would have been less of a thorn in John Major's flesh. That's simply unrealistic. International jobs were out of the question. After all, Mrs. Thatcher had spent 12 years being rude to almost every international organization you can think of, and therefore none of them are going to really give her priority in leading them.
At home, there was no political role for her, and the former Prime Minister was forced to spend her days like minor royalty, touring garden centres and visiting new displays at museums.
You would have had a heart of stone not to have understood the frustration that she must have faced. I think I have always been an observer of people. I don't think you needed to be a very acute observer to realize that what had happened to her must have been immensely hurtful.
After he became Prime Minister, John Major never seemed at ease in her company.
The first time I ever saw them together in public was at a charity function, and they went outside and stood there in front of the assembled, you know what it's like, the huge array of flashing lights and television cameras, and of course there are always people shouting questions.
Is Mr. Major doing a good job as Prime Minister?
Yes. Excellent.
Any hard
Triple A.
And it suddenly burst with rain, and Margaret turned to John and said, "It didn't rain very much when I was Prime Minister." And of course she meant it light-heartedly and as a joke, but it was taken very badly, and you could see how deeply John felt about this, because he failed to laugh. He didn't think it was funny. He took it very personally. I think he felt emotionally uncomfortable when in her presence. At least that was my impression from that occasion.
In March 1991, John Major visited Bonn and set about rebuilding the relations with the rest of Europe that Mrs. Thatcher had so badly damaged. Like President Bush, the German Chancellor, Helmut Kohl, found the new Prime Minister's emollient style a welcome change.
When I became Prime Minister, the relationship with our European partners was frankly rather poor. They took the view that the British stood apart, they shouted from the terraces, but they rarely engaged in the main game. And I thought the best way to proceed was to go into Europe and set out my concerns, my hopes, my aspirations, the things I would concede, the things I couldn't accept, in a speech actually inside Europe.
With the help of the pro-European Chris Patten, John Major wrote a speech that seemed calculated to offend Mrs. Thatcher and please the Europeans.
My aims for Britain in the community can be simply stated. I want us to be where we belong, at the very heart of Europe.
The battle lines were drawn up. On a visit to America, Margaret Thatcher made her concerns about Europe plain in a series of speeches.
She was totally opposed to the greater involvement in Europe, the greater move to federalism. And she'd stood out very strongly against that, the no, no, no at the dispatch box in the House of Commons. And she saw that being weakened. And that certainly intensified her disenchantment with John Major.
Margaret Thatcher established a foundation to ensure her legacy was preserved. She surrounded herself with loyal acolytes who shared her more outspoken views, especially on Europe.
Their concern was to boost her, to make her feel better, to encourage her in everything that she had done. And one of the ways they did it was by disparaging everybody else. And then, of course, they carried every whisper, every mention, every tiny bit of frustration she uttered in private out into public. And so it spread out into the public prints and began to spread into the Conservative Party as well.
In the summer of 1991, an article appeared in the Telegraph in which Margaret Thatcher was reported as being openly critical of John Major. She was alleged to have dismissed him as a grey man with no ideas.
Almost in terms of a Greek tragedy, we were forced apart by the activities of events and people who muttered and talked about what it was Margaret thought in private.
John Major's public image was of an easygoing man, but behind the scenes he could be temperamental. Mrs. Thatcher's comments made him seethe with rage. His political secretary, Judith Chaplin, wrote in her diary at the time that Mrs. Thatcher made him furious and that he called her loopy and mad. She wrote that he said he wanted the former Prime Minister isolated, destroyed.
It was at a time when almost daily there seemed to be reports of what Margaret had said. Whether she had said them or not, I don't know, but there were reports that were causing great difficulty within the party. So I was very frustrated, and I think there's no doubt at times, in the privacy with someone whom I thought I could trust, no doubt I let off steam. Quite a different matter, I think, from a considered view later.
The issue of Europe above all drove them apart, but John Major's other policies widened the gulf and led to accusations of betrayal. He scrapped Mrs. Thatcher's poll tax. He gave more money than she had planned to the health service and boosted government spending.
It was to be Thatcherism with a human face, and his actions demonstrated that. But Mrs. Thatcher was out there rampaging about, deciding that she didn't approve of what was being done. Now she was no longer there and wasn't able to be a backseat driver.
While the Prime Minister was touchy about Mrs. Thatcher, he was also thin-skinned about the press and media. Although this was one of the hazards of the job, the lampooning could be hurtful.